Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs here at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. And I want to welcome everybody. We have a big attendance online. So welcome to our audience online and to people here to another Eye on Africa panel. So as some of you may know, since January, the African Studies Center has been celebrating 65 years of existence. We have had different programming looking at various milestones of the center and the future may hold for African studies here at MSU. So in today's panel, we'll engage on discussions on African language learning and the role that FLAS, foreign language and area studies fellowships play in that language learning. We are very grateful to our alumni here that's gonna lead us into discussing language learning here at MSU. And there will be introductions shortly. But I also wanted to highlight that today's panel is dedicated to Dr. Anne Joyce Bierstecker, who was the former African Studies Center Associate Director and FLAS coordinator who passed away on February 11th, 2025. Anne was a very beautiful human being with an unwavering commitment to student and student success. And our moderator, I'm gonna pass it over to her. Emily will open the discussion with some words about Anne, and she's also gonna moderate the remaining of the panel. So Emily, I pass it on to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. We'll just be sort of playing a little bit of a Zoom musical chairs here. It's so nice to be back. Thank you, Awa. Thank you, African Studies Center for having me and having all of us. And as she mentioned, I'll be sort of moderating the panel, giving a little bit of a tribute to Anne. I'll introduce our panelists and then kind of give my own also reflections, which I was originally asked to do. So first we have Elena Boer, who is the Assistant Director for Global Research at the Center for Gender and Global Context here at MSU. In her current role, she supports faculty and student-led research on gender and sexuality. Her personal research focuses on women's empowerment and sustainable water management in East Africa. At the GenCen, she functions as a lead for all Africa-based collaborations with global gender centers. And she was a FLAS recipient at MSU for Swahili. Then to my immediate right is Dr. Robin Kriegler, who is a visiting assistant professor of history at Valparaiso University and a historian of modern South Africa with a special emphasis on satire and stand-up comedy, which makes me very jealous as a research topic. He's currently working on his first book, entitled Inevitable Satirists, Histories of South African Humor, 1910 to 1965, and an edited volume of audience-centered studies of African performance, and Robin was a FLAS recipient for Zulu. Okay, and then here we have Maria Martin. Dr. Maria Martin is a Black Studies Africanist, and Women and Gender Studies scholar at the University of California, Merced. She uses her training in Black Studies to inform her research, which centers Nigerian women's activism and intellectual history. She's a Bill and Melinda Gates Scholarship alumna and has won several prestigious Fulbright Awards in addition to receiving an honorable mention from the Ford Foundation for her research. Maria was a FLAS recipient here at MSU for Yoruba. And I'll introduce, I suppose, Tiffany once she gets here. I should also introduce myself, I suppose. My name is Emily Riley. I am a currently or just recently tenured professor and researcher at El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. in the Center for Asian and African Studies. And so I'm really glad that we were able to sort of dedicate this to Anne, to Dr. Anne Bursteiker, who I got to know and will truly miss. And so I just wanted to sort of give a little bit of her background and sort of how I know her. She received her PhD in African Studies from the University of Wisconsin in 1984. In which she wrote a 1,000-page dissertation on grammatical, Zach, this might interest you, grammatical aspects of Kiembu narratives from the Mountain Kenya region. From there, she started her career at Northern Illinois University and on to Yale, where she developed and directed the university's African languages program for 28 years before coming to MSU to serve as the associate director and FLAS coordinator extraordinaire. Anne wrote extensively about Kiswahili poetry and African linguistics. She was a fierce defender of Title VI programs and an important part of the Association for African Studies programs. I knew Anne as the FLAS director and initially as the nice lady who gave me money. But over my graduate years, I got to know her and recognize her deep love for African languages, something we both shared. When she had to take a leave of absence for health reasons in 2016, I, as a newly minted PhD, attempted to fill her shoes and temporarily coordinate the FLAS scholarships. Despite not feeling well and being back home in Milwaukee, she was generous in showing me the ropes from a distance in the pre-Zoom era, if anyone can remember what that was like. And then I took on, and then, in another way that I knew Anne was when I took on a sort of leadership role within the Association for African Studies programs, AASP. And for those who don't know, AASP is sort of an association that brings together all of the Title VI programs, such as MSU, University of Wisconsin, Boston University, Harvard, Yale, all of these programs that are those who give out FLAS, right? Since we're here to talk about that. And so they're Howard, yeah, Berkeley, Indiana, right, Florida, all of those. Sorry, I'm not mentioning all of them, but yeah. So some of the big names in African studies, and MSU has been part of that. Dave knows for a very long time, right? And the association is this wonderful space for the directors of these centers and other people to sort of gather and think of ideas about how to better run their programs. And when I was the assistant director at the University of Kansas for African Studies, I was part of that. And so, I was very fortunate to know Anne in that capacity as well, because she had been part of the association for a long time. And she, sort of showed me the ropes again on sort of how to function in there. And I remember being with her at Capitol Hill, stomping for Fulbright funding, FLAS funding, which, as we know is not to get super political, but is a privilege that we hope to keep, right? And so that was something that, and so again, through that, she showed me just, again, her dedication and love for African languages, African linguistics, African studies programs. And she will be truly missed. And so, and check out her scholarship about, African linguistics in general, about Kiswahili, and poetry specifically. And then to not totally like dominate the floor here, I just wanted to sort of, I had sent out a few questions to everybody, to sort of say, here's some guiding things that we could maybe talk about. And I got to thinking, what was my relationship with FLAS? How has it made, an impact on my life? And before I even knew what FLAS was, I came to MSU to study Wolof. That was my goal in life, was to do a PhD in whatever program they would accept me in, but as long as I could learn Wolof. And I did that. And I am, forever grateful to the African Studies Center, which was my home for many years during my PhD program. And I think FLAS is one of the truly most extraordinary, interdisciplinary academic funding sources, period, across disciplines. And to give an example, the center in Mexico City where I work, I have several colleagues that were also FLAS fellows in Indonesian, in Tagalog, from Lima, Peru to Seattle, Washington, to other parts, and we are all sort of also then found each other kind of in this center, just to sort of show this kind of also global reach of an impact of FLAS, both in African languages, in Asian languages. I met a Fulbright scholar from the US the other day that was in Mexico who had FLAS to learn Zapoteca in the southern part of Mexico. And so it has a very, broad reach. And just to sort of give one anecdote that I think is sort of the perfect way for me to demonstrate the importance that FLAS has had for me and generally, is that the main research that I do, and when I was in, I had been studying Wolof for many years, both here with a year FLAS, an annual FLAS, and then would have the opportunity to go to Senegal and continue Wolof classes with a professor in Dakar. And so when I was doing and then obviously FLAS sort of was the gateway drug, right, to Fulbright. So I received a Fulbright to then go to Dakar and do longer doctoral research. Thanks to David Wiley, I teach my students your Fulbright formula, that, the hook sentence.
Like that book.
Yeah. So when I was in, part of my research was, and now kind of my book project has been looking at sort of elite African women in politics. And so these are women who, have a lot of people kind of interested in them after them. And I had been researching this one particular Senegalese politician, and I finally got the chance to maybe meet her, and I was, and at that point I had been studying Wolof very extensively. And I was at a sort of a rally or a meeting that she was at, and I got up the courage to go talk to her. And I, had been following her for a long time. I got up there and I spoke to her in Wolof, and she sort of was like, whoa, like, who is this lady? And she looked at me and she said, I have so many of you people, right? Journalists, white people, like whatever, that want to ask, researchers that want to ask me questions. She goes, you know what? But I'm going to give you an interview because you came up to me and you spoke to me in Wolof. And that was important to her. And that was a huge in for me and completely changed, I think, the possibilities of research, the possibilities of having a certain kind of credibility and relatability to people that would not have been the same with just French or English. And so to me, that is sort of the best way I can think of to show the importance of FLAS and of learning languages. So I'll leave that there for my part, at least until Q&A. So now that so Dr. Tiffany Caesar has arrived, I'll introduce you, and then we'll start with Elena. So Dr. Tiffany Caesar is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at San Francisco State University. She calls herself a Black woman's activist due to her ongoing research on the preservation of transnational Black women leaders and engagement with public history. Queen Mother Moore, Margaret Walker, and Phyllis Ntala, to name a few. And there's a little bit of a long bio. She's finishing her book called Archiving Africana Women's Stories, African-Centered Education in South Africa and Detroit. Tiffany received the FLAS scholarship to study Zulu in South Africa, which allowed her to further her research that included South African women who owned and operated African-centered institutions and their roles in leadership. So thanks for joining us. So the floor is yours, Selena.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to see everybody in here today. I thought we were going to be meeting online because I just keep assuming everything's online, but luckily I was right down the hallway. So I'm at Michigan State. I'm in the Center for Gender and Global Context, which we call GenSen. And I'm the assistant director for global research there. But I am a recent grad of MSU and got my PhD from the Department of Sociology and the Environmental Science and Policy program. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists today. So I'm glad that we're all in person. I studied Swahili for my grad studies. I should back up and say that during my undergraduate studies, I went to Kenya twice and I worked for a local community-based grassroots organization that was doing research on how communities could manage local water wells that people were installing. I was working as an evaluation research intern and really loved the work and had developed some good relationships there. So I decided that I wanted to keep doing that research however possible, and that looked like a PhD program was the way to do that. But I had not had a chance to learn Swahili because who was going to teach me Swahili at my little university that I was going to before this. So I decided to come to Michigan State actually because I knew that they had a Swahili program. Like that's the edge that MSU had for me. And so I got into Swahili right away and took a first year, 2 semesters of it and soaked it up. And then I went and did an intensive summer FLAS program in Tanzania. And both of those it was a great experience. And then I decided that I was going to go to Kenya to go visit some of my friends the summer after, or the weeks after that had finished. And that was what my motivation had been the whole year to get through that first crazy year of grad school was I'm going to go back and I'm going to be able to speak Swahili. And that had really motivated me. And when I got back, there were so many people who on those trips when I had been there previously and could only speak English, who I had never been able to speak to without an interpreter before. And there's so much that's lost, not just in translation, but because somebody is being filtered through another person that's there. And so my housekeeper was the chattiest lady, and she was always trying to talk to me, but she could never actually speak to me because she could only speak the local language in Swahili. And so the day that I got back, I surprised her by speaking Swahili, and we sat down and had tea together, and the election was coming up. And she said, I wouldn't share this with you if your interpreter or translator was here, but I have so much to tell you about what's going on in the local government. And I was like, give me all of it. I want to hear all of it. And that was the moment that I knew this is so worth it, because not only, I mean, this is just an interpersonal connection, but this is going to transfer over to all of my research as well. And I'm a qualitative methodologist. So I use interviews and focus groups and ethnography. So I need to be able to talk to people. And so I'm also a feminist methodologist, and that means that I try to hear from as many perspectives as possible on one issue or one process to be able to understand that process from so many different perspectives and try to find all of the perspectives of truth in each one of those people, but to also prioritize the perspective of the marginalized people, all the marginalized perspectives. And that's really what I was missing in my research, was because a lot of the people who I spoke with were less educated, which in that context meant that they were mainly women or elderly people from rural areas. And those were the folks who I wanted to engage with most for my research. So I went back to MSU, kept studying Swahili, and I went back 3 more times for my dissertation. A little bit interrupted here and there because I had COVID in the middle of it. But because of FLAS, I got to go and conduct research. And I think that FLAS had a couple of important impacts, like just speaking Swahili had a couple of important impacts. And one of them was, of course, we talk about like logistics and safety from being able to speak the language, but those were foundational to be able to empower me to go and form social connections when I was in that community. So I already had the basis of friends who I knew there, but when somebody asked me, could you come over and have dinner with my family? I wasn't scared to get in the car and go through the police checkpoint with somebody on speed dial to drive to that person's house and to have dinner with them and with their family when maybe their husband and their kids didn't speak English. So I got to hear from so many different people that way. It allowed me to say yes so many times instead of just going home, closing the door, and like trying to transcribe my interviews from the day. I got to actually engage with people. And that informed my perspective even more than just doing interviews could have. And it also meant that I had good connections with people who weren't just the research participants, who when I came back to the US and was interpreting data or I had written a chapter, I could say, hey, I want to make sure that I'm actually presenting people in the right light, or that I've interpreted this piece of data correctly. Could you review what I've written? And I knew that I was going to get honest feedback from them because they felt comfortable critiquing my work. They didn't have much at stake in criticizing me because they already knew that we were friends. So that was one of the ways, was that social connection. The other way was that I got to translate all of the data myself. So while I was transcribing and translating it, I got to dig into the meaning of each word and really ask, what's the deeper meaning of this? And is there maybe not an English word that quite captures this correctly? Is this an idea that I can dig into? Even the grammar that people use, like the difference between when people use the subjunctive, it triggers a different mood when people are speaking that made me ask, why are they using the subjunctive in this case? And so I brought all of that into my dissertation. And then, so that was really important. But I also think, like you were saying, speaking Swahili didn't just mean that I got to understand people better. It meant that I sent a message back to people. So the people who I was interviewing were willing to speak to me, or maybe we built rapport more quickly because they appreciated that I had taken the time to learn the local language. And so I think that was an important basis for me to be able to conduct what I think is like ethical feminist research. And then now in the position that I'm in, I interviewed for it while I was still writing my dissertation, and I didn't think I would get it at all, but I found out later on, once they hired me, that speaking Swahili, to my surprise, gave me a competitive edge. Even though this is a global center, they said that they were looking for somebody who was an Africa specialist because they wanted to be able to start building more relationships with African gender centers. So that was really helpful. But it was also helpful to be able to show that I had done the work that was required to practice feminist ethics and be able to advise other people or other students on doing that kind of work. So it was so foundational for my own research, but also in getting this job. So it's an important part of who I am now, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks. Tiffany?
I have a presentation. Will I be able to show it, or?
Oof. Maybe.
Can I share it with you? So can I go after the next
Sure,
person?
sure,
Thank
yeah.
you so much.
Okay, so we'll I'll hand it over to you, Robin.
Well, I have to echo what the last presenter said and what Emily has said. I'm really excited to be here. I haven't been at MSU in 3 years. Got my PhD in 2021, and then I did an additional year of teaching as a fixed term here. So it's really exciting to be back and see some familiar faces. And I was talking to Emily before the session started. I remember in 2015, I had no idea what FLAS was. I had been a year out of undergrad, so I really didn't understand much about sort of graduate school and professional academia at all. I remember, actually, I think it was Anne encouraging me as I was literally in the process of moving towards MSU. I was in the lobby of a motel in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, filling in the application for FLAS to do Zulu, even though I hadn't, I hadn't actually thought to do it, I guess, previously in my admissions process. And I ended up doing 2 academic year FLASes and then an intensive summer program in Durban, South Africa, doing Zulu. And that was also a really, really special time for me because that was my first time ever being in South Africa, being on the African continent in general. And, FLAS is a program that I think is, it really resonated when Emily said that, like, I knew that I was going to do Wolof by any means necessary, right? It didn't matter what discipline. I was kind of the same way with South Africa. I had never been to South Africa. I had no family connection to South Africa. What I had sort of gone down was this circa 2010 social media rabbit hole. The only way I talk about it is like how some people get really, really into Japan. They get really, really into the UK because they start watching Doctor Who. I got introduced to South African music and eventually stand-up comedy, basically sitting at my computer in 2010. And it kind of took over more and more of my life. When my first 2 years of undergrad, I thought I was going to be a Middle East guy. I had done Middle Eastern history my senior year in high school, and I started Arabic classes at my undergraduate institution. I thought, I might graduate into a very lucrative career with some think tank or the CIA or something. And I realized that actually, like, what I was doing in my spare time, what I was pursuing, the news that I was following was almost exclusively African and South African in nature. And so the FLAS program was such a godsend for me because, as this sort of like white kid from the suburbs, it enabled me to learn this language that I wouldn't have had any means to do otherwise. And when you get to South Africa, okay. When you get to South Africa in particular, I mean, in other parts of Africa, I think this might also be the case, but especially in South Africa, when you know African languages, the country becomes a dramatically larger place. And one of the legacies of apartheid is that, the sort of cultural default, or, the society in many ways is still sort of oriented and built around an Anglophone or a white kind of like subject, right? But that is such a small minority within the entire range and scope of South African society. And so when you actually are kind of dumped in at the deep end, as I was that first summer that I spent in Durban, living with a Zulu-speaking family, taking taxis into the CBD every day and sort of navigating that whole, by far the most sort of like fish out of water experience that I had ever experienced in my life thus far. It gives you a dramatically different perspective than, even a lot of people that you meet living within South Africa. And you have a tremendous amount of privilege because you navigate, I found myself, using Zulu to navigate daily life But then when people find that you are an American who has come to South Africa to study Zulu, just kind of to echo what the previous anecdote was, like you like that gives you a very, very unique perspective because you are an outsider. But because you're sort of an American, and I don't know if this is true anymore, certainly maybe not in South Africa. But in my experience, you know, you became in many ways kind of this like safe space for people, because you could converse in this language, but you also, you know, were it was valuable to people to tell you things because you weren't actually part of South African society, right? So it was kind of you could be entrusted with things. And that's something that I think, you know, really stays with you and really has benefited my work. My work is, you know, a lot of it also on comedy and humor. So you find yourself in a lot of different spaces where a variety of different languages are being used, and to be able to navigate those spaces decently and meaningfully, I think can't be underestimated in terms of importance. And I guess the last thing that I will say about the value of FLAS and the value of this language learning is that when I think about graduate school, you're learning languages anyway. And it's kind of this constant process of translation because you are socializing yourself to this very, very strange kind of setting of scholars and academics, and really adapting yourself, feeling in a very, very insecure, fish out of water kind of way as you're navigating through 5 or 6 or more years of graduate school. And I also felt like it was a very grounding experience to be using some of those skills and that work of like socialization and translation towards a task that was a little bit less rarefied and, I don't know how you would describe it, maybe picayune, elitist, obscure, then I felt like, because that is the tension that you're always sort of thinking of when you're going and getting a PhD, is you're trying to cram yourself into a very narrow space and feel very conversant and sort of qualified within that space. But when you're learning an African language or when you're learning any kind of language, you're not necessarily, you know, you're going into it with the intention that you're not necessarily going to become, you know, the world's greatest Zulu expert. You're not going to become the world's greatest speaker of this language, the same way you might be the world's greatest scholar of some narrow thing. And it's valuable conversing to people from all walks of life. And I think it keeps you grounded in a really important way. And so I can't imagine going through grad school and that whole process without, I think, having that to continually remind myself of along that journey. So thank you.
You're ready? Okay. Okay, so I'll hand it over now to Tiffany.
The presentation, do I just?
Oh,
Okay. So I just want to say thank you all so much. I'm very excited to be here today. And please excuse my delay. I was staying at the Kellogg's. It's been a while since I've been at Michigan State University. And geographically, I am not there. And I didn't realize like how far it was. And so I remember leaving the hotel and I'm thinking like, oh, it's very close. But, you know, if you haven't been to Michigan State in a while, you realize that, you know, the International Center is actually on the other side. So I got a good walk before I came to this wonderful presentation. So I guess I want to share that I feel that, you know, traveling and using language is one of the the most beautiful things that you can do to connect you to a a global world. And sorry, I'm also looking at this computer trying to figure out like how am I
I
don't
think
know.
somebody else is controlling it.
Okay. So can we go to the next slide? All right. Okay, thank you so much. I received the FLAS fellowship in the fall of 2014. And I received it to study Zulu with Dr. Sabanda. And so I'm so happy to see him. And I received it twice. I studied it with Dr. Sabanda here at Michigan State University. And I also studied it in South Africa, right? So it was just a really, really, a really great experience. And then I was a PhD student in African American and African Studies. And that was in 2014. And I came to Michigan State in 2012. And I'm so happy to see Dr. Martin because, you know, we were here around the same time. But you all, that was 12 years ago. And I'm still kind of like flabbergasted about how long it's been, right? The African American African Studies program had a language requirement. And so I know things have changed over time, but when we were getting our PhD, we had to do a language. And the language that I chose was Zulu. And on that particular journey of understanding language and culture, Dr. Sabanda and Dr. Edozie were very influential in assisting me. I believe language opened doors to authentic cultural experiences. My research interest then was centered on African-centered schools, and I knew that I wanted to look at a school in South Africa called the African Union International School. And even though it was an international school in which they were learning the English, I knew in order for me to navigate that school as well as other people within South Africa, the language would just allow me to just deepen relationships with people. My introduction to Zulu allowed me to appreciate South Africa's diverse cultural heritage and immerse myself authentically into everyday life. Can we go to the next slide? What brought you to want to study a language with FLAS and how has it benefited my career? So I'm gonna go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the benefits, which align with many of the participants' benefits already, which really centers this ideal of cultivating authentic relationships with the people within the country. And so the FLAS Fellowship opened doors to new academic and cultural experiences. In addition, that was just one of the first fellowships that I received. Many of the wonderful participants on this panel talk about other, fellowships that they received, like the Fulbright or, other rewards or scholarships that having the FLAS under your belt really assisted. And for me, I received the Nelson Mandela Museum, Michigan State University Curatorial Fellowship. I received that twice, which allowed me to go to South Africa and do research at the Nelson Mandela Museum. And that is, which I really didn't realize, and I think we can all talk about like our research experiences, but that's where I began to cultivate my own theoretical framework called a Black womanist archival tradition. And I didn't realize that, but if I didn't go to the Nelson Mandela Museum and get introduced to Phyllis Dendala, who was a South African writer, activist during the anti-apartheid, I wouldn't be cultivating this theory on archiving Africana women's stories, right? And I would say that I directly correlate that to the FLAS Fellowship by introducing me to Zulu and centering me in this, this relationship with language and culture. In addition to that, I also created the first installments of the Ubuntu Dialogues at Michigan State University, centering conversations between students from South Africa and the United States. During that particular time, I also brought Dr. Siyabola Mandela a South African diplomat focusing on international development and peace resolutions to come to MSU as an Ubuntu Dialogue guest. Now, over the years, the Ubuntu Dialogues has expanded greatly. There has been conferences, cohorts, and things of that nature. But, my ability to connect with different institutions on South Africa's, in South Africa, including the Nelson Mandela Museum, Stellenbosch, right? Nelson Mandela University, all those particular things occurred because of my appreciation, right, of culture. And you cannot go to another country without an appreciation of language. And so the FLAS fellowship allowed me to do that. It also allowed me to cultivate Pan-African relationships and networks. My research is centered surrounding the relationship Africans have with Africans in the diaspora. And so this allowed me to connect with other scholars, right, in South Africa, who also had this desire to create these Pan-African networks and institutions that centered decolonizing white hegemonic structures, right? And so that's one of the reasons why African-centered schools were very important to me, because it's one of the spaces in which you have those particular conversations, right? That also centers and encourages, African history, culture, broadly. I'm gonna go to the next slide that talks about like the research. And so my research has really expanded over the years. My first article was Pan-Africanism, Education, and Exploratory Study of African-Centered Schools in Cameroon and South Africa. My first research article was published by UNISA. All right. And I don't know, there's something about going to South Africa and the way that they welcome you, right? And you really get to see Ubuntu and what Ubuntu really is. And those scholars in South Africa made me feel like I was a part of a family. So my first article, Pan-Africanism and Education, an exploratory study of African-centered schools in Cameroon and South Africa, was published in the University of South Africa Commonwealth and Development Journal. And that may have been around 2016. I'm not sure, okay? But it was there, right? And then later, while I was in South Africa, because I feel that the FLAS fellowship was the gateway to get me into the country, you see. I also wrote a part of a collective with a collective of scholars, Africana women leaders of African-centered education, a portraiture of mothering Pan-Africanism and nation building in Africa. And that was published in New Frontiers in the Study of Global Africa, African Diaspora. And that was published in 2018. So my first two research articles centered South Africa, right? Centered South African institutions, centered experiences of Africans in the diaspora in South Africa, right? And again, just being able to have a respect for the culture as well as a respect for the language allowed me to do that. Since then, my research has really expanded. It's been 12 years. My research has really expanded, and I'm really centering a Black womanist archival tradition, which for me is a way in which Africana women preserve their histories and stories that deviates from traditional archival practices. So sometimes when we think of archival practices, we kind of think of like the museums, right, and the libraries and things of that nature. But a lot of scholars look at, particularly when it comes to people of color, diverse ways in which we archive our works. And so that may be, a box of pictures, underneath the bed, right? There might be a particular jewelry piece that is dated back to a particular movement that happened. That might be a story, you know, valuing like this oral history that's passed down. And so a lot of my work is centering around cultivating that particular theoretical framework. And I was able to talk a little bit about it in the preservation of the Phyllis Wheatley Poetry Festival 50th anniversary at Jackson State University. And I've published 2 journals based on that. And one of them I brought, which is the Callaloo Journal, right? The Callaloo Literary Journal, because I was also a Margaret Walker Fellow. But I bring this because it would not have occurred if I didn't go to the Nelson Mandela Museum, right? And find the autobiography of Phyllis Ndala in the Nelson Mandela Museum, which kind of opened this door of women and transnational leadership and histories, right? And again, these experiences and respect for culture as well as language. But also my research has not stopped when it comes to centering African stories and identities. I've recently been involved in public health, right? Looking at public health and particularly the ways we can think about how African American histories and experiences in public health can assist refugees, right, in different African communities. Because in my particular perspective, African Americans in the United States still don't have full citizenship. Okay. So thinking about these particular ideals and thinking about these particular political engagement allows me to work with other scholars who are wanting to connect Africans and African diaspora people together when it comes to similar narratives and similar experiences. Can we go to the next slides? The next slides. And so the next things I show is pictures, and you all can't see them, but the people in the Zoom world, you all can see them. I show pictures of when I was here at the African Studies Center with Dr. Sia Mandela and him coming for the Ubuntu dialogues and sharing his experience. We were both young then. This was before I was a doctor, and this was before he's a doctor. Now he is an international diplomat going around South Africa, helping with things surrounding, you know, international diplomacy as well as peace resolutions, right? But as you see, the African Studies Center programs, right, and people have always cultivated these particular relationships that encourage students, just like you all, right, to cultivate these very diverse relationships. The next photo shows me with several of our partners from South Africa, right? There is a representative from Stellenbosch, a representative from the Nelson Mandela Museum, and then we see Marsha and Kurt, who were from the MSU Museum, right? And these particular relationships that center these networks that allow students and staff and faculty to work collectively on programs to create dialogue surrounding social injustices and solidarity. The last picture is me and some of the students in my program. And I want to shout out Nozama, who recently, I believe, just received her PhD from Stellenbosch. She was also here in Michigan State University studying as well. And so cultivating those particular relationships and further following faculty and students on particular issues was very, very important. My last thing I just want to share is say, trust the process, you know, when it comes to like the FLAS fellowship, right? You know, if you haven't thought about getting the FLAS fellowship, do it. Just do it. I don't think that if I didn't take Dr. Sabanda's class, right, you know, if I did not, you know, be a part of the African Studies Center, I see, I'm gonna say Dr. Lisa Fouget, you know, because she did so much. She did so much. While if I didn't have these particular experiences, right, I would not be here today. So I'm very grateful for my FLAS, my FLAS fellowships and how it opened the door that allows me to continue my research now. Thank you.
We'll move it on to Maria, but I'd like to second the Dr. Lisa Fruget. If she hasn't already received an honorary degree.
I love you all.
We love you more.
All right, so my name is Dr. Martin. I'm at the University of California, Merced, the newest UC campus. And when I came into FLAS, so I think it might be unorthodox, but I'm going to say it was a move of God. Because when I parked my car right across the street, I will never forget that. I parked my car right across the street from the International Center, and I had a 99 Pontiac Grand Prix. I whipped it. I said, okay, guys. I came into the African American and African Studies program with no funding, a PhD program with no funding. And I said, God, I am not going to take out any more loans for education. Now, I know you didn't bring me here for no reason. You didn't allow me to come here for no reason. And I said, God, your word says that you will provide all of my needs. So please provide for me, because all I know is I'm not taking out any more loans. And so all of my trust was on God at that point. I said, in Jesus' name, amen. Now, after that, I always had provision, right? And I see that prayer as as obedience, and obedience is a key that allows you to experience power, right? So the power of God in my belief. So I leaned on God, and He gave the provision, so when I came into the FLAS. So another thing that I'll say too is that I have 4 Fulbrights, and every time again that I prayed, right, I went to a church here, Pilgrim's Rest Missionary Baptist Church in Lansing, and the pastor one day talked about a prayer practice called Lectio Divina. And so I said, oh, I'm gonna try this. And when I tried it, oh boy, I prayed, right? So I had to go to Nigeria to do my research. And I'm like, again, no funding, nothing. I met a student actually when I was in Nigeria from the U of M who funded her whole study, like her whole research stay. And I was like, wow, your university did that well. But for me, I had Fulbrights. But every time I prayed, right, or every time I did a Fulbright application, I would pray using the word, using scriptures in the Bible that attended to my situation. So I just personalized the scripture and I prayed it. And again, I got 4 Fulbrights doing that. Like that was my method, that was like a part of my method. It was prayer. Right. And so every time it came through, I said, wait a minute, I think something's happening here. So, the provision was there. And I think that the FLAS was also one of the ways that God provided for me to, pay for this whole PhD program. And it blows my mind it blows my mind when I think back on it. I got here with no funding. And 6 good years of a PhD program were all paid for, and I did not have to take out any loans for it. So the then director of the African American and African Studies program, Dr. Rita Kiki Dozier, she did so much for the students that she brought in and to shape the program and to make sure we had international experience and we had experience in Africa. And she suggested that I do the FLAS, but I was going to do Wolof, and she said, you should do Yoruba. And I was like, okay. And she said that Yoruba, has more of a representation throughout the diaspora. Yorubas are like, so there were many more topics that I could study, many more time periods, many more locations, and, things like that. There were kind of maybe more broader possibilities for me to come up with dissertation topics, studying Yoruba. So I studied Yoruba. I filled out the FLAS application, and, it covered the tuition and, things like that. So it was very, very helpful. And I got that 3 years in a row. So I did that for 3 years. And then I was at the point where I needed to go and do my research. And I realized when I was applying for the Fulbright, and I did take Dr. Wiley and Dr. Bresnahan's class, I still talk to my students about that hook sentence. I love reading proposals and commenting on them. And people come to me to, read their Fulbright proposals and things. And that's one thing that I always note in there. You got to have that hook sentence. So, yeah, so I realized that when I was applying for the Fulbrights, I said, oh, I peep game. I think there's a trajectory here that if you have this language experience, then you can move to, this intercultural experience more. So when they're looking at your application for these Fulbrights, one part of it is that they want to know that you'll be able to go there and do the research, and that you won't you won't collapse under the fear of being in a new cultural context. So they want to know that you'll be able to actually see this research through. And when they see that you either have traveled there before, or you've had some type of field experience before, or linguistic and cultural experience, that does help. For you to apply. It strengthens your application, I feel, to Fulbright. So I definitely had a lot of, FLAS experience, Yoruba study for 3 years. But before I even went to Nigeria to do more language study, I went to Florida. The University of Florida is a hub for African languages. And I did their summer intensive program for Yoruba. And there I met the director of their African languages or African studies program, Dr. Akinyemi. And so when I left that program really helped me a lot to advance in Yoruba language. But after I left that program, they had this Fulbright GPA program that would take people to Nigeria to study Yoruba. So I applied for that and I got that. And that was through the University of Florida. So, having the FLAS and then going to the University of Florida helped me to actually go and set foot in Nigeria. Right. So that was the first Fulbright that I did actually in Nigeria. And I applied for another one, the DDRA, and I got that one to do my doctoral dissertation research abroad in Nigeria. But on that trip, I learned a lot. I stayed with families. It was really wonderful. And again, I grew in my Yoruba and, the use and especially the hearing, so I really got good at hearing Yoruba and understanding, so my listening comprehension, because I could speak it well, I could read it, but hearing the actual people's voices, that was really helpful being there. And also staying with the families as well. So I broadened my network too, because now that I'm there in the country, I was able to meet a lot of people. And I met my research assistant who actually was with me during my doctoral dissertation research abroad there. And is still a really good friend of mine today. So he helped me to collect interviews, get through sketchy situations on the roadsides and, all kinds of things. Very, very thankful for him, Joseph Ayodokun. So the, FLAS really helped me to get into that language program in Florida, which helped me to get into that Fulbright GPA and set foot in Nigeria. And then that also helped me to, apply for other Fulbrights and say that I've been there. I've had, by that time, I think that program was actually worth, it was 8 weeks, but I think it was worth a whole year or so of language study. So that's 4 years, I think, about at that time, 4 years of Yoruba. So very strong, application, I think, for Fulbright. So I got that. And, one thing too that I would want to note for me I call myself a Black Studies Africanist because my training in Black Studies informs the way that I study Africa. I realize that from Black Studies, we care about building from the indigenous and making sure that the voices of Black people, African descended people, African people are heard in the research that we do. And we also care about giving back to those communities that we take from. So one principle of Black studies that I carry very strongly with me is to reconnect the community with the university. So to that end, I founded an organization in Nigeria, which is to help students to navigate educational, obstacles. There was a student that wanted to go to college. Someone suggested sex work to her. And I said, oh, well, we really need to try to help. And so we founded, my colleague there helped to found the organization. And we graduated her. We helped her, get the things that she needed. And she just graduated and she's going to be applying to graduate schools here in the US too. So, I think that from that Black Studies training, it really made me want to give back and reconnect the community and the university in meaningful ways, but also that view of building from the indigenous. It really helped me in my research because when I went to Nigeria, I had all these Black feminist theories, and then I was like, oh, I don't think that this works really. So then I had to start to rethink, okay, well, what do I want to do? How do I want to put this together? And I developed a theory basically. So I developed a theory, an original theory for my research. But in order to do that, I had to do something that I call meta history. I went backwards. So, when you do meta or you have metadata, that is data that you mined from other data. Right? That's metadata. So I did meta history. I went backward in their historical record, and I was studying among the Yoruba people. So I went backward into pre-colonial cosmology and thought, and philosophy, into, Yoruba thinking, right, about the world and worldview. And in order to understand forward in their history. So I went backward to understand forward. And so I used history to do history. So that's meta history for me. And I developed a theory that explained this really novel idea of nationalism that women came up with that I saw in the archives. And it was non-political nationalism. So I was studying nationalism and I was using the archives at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. And I kept seeing these non-political declarations that women were making. And I was like, well, what is non-political nationalism? And so in order to understand that, I used some of the elements of, pre-colonial thought and culture that I saw these women implementing in their ideology of non-political nationalism. And so I used that to form my history, my intellectual history of African women, there in Nigeria. And so I presented it. I did a Fulbright and went to South Africa. So while I was on my Fulbright, actually, all right. I did the dissertation research and left, and then I had a Fulbright to come back to, the University of Ibadan. I taught classes there. I taught gender studies, actually, graduate course there. And then while I was on that Fulbright, I got another Fulbright to go to South Africa. And that's where I presented my research, and the political scientists in South Africa really like the research. So they asked me to be a part of the African Association for Political Science. And I was like, well, I'm not a political scientist. Well, I'm a historian. But I really love the ability to present my research in different parts of the continent and see how it was received, and it's received differently there than it is here. And we can talk about that later. But if I had not taken or used the FLAS, right? If I had not got the FLAS, if God had not opened that door for me, I wouldn't have been able to, travel to Nigeria or have these other, Fulbright experiences. And those things really helped me being in the context. I said context really matters, because being in the context helped me to formulate a new theory of how, these women historically developed this ideal of nationalism. And so I think one of the arguments that I make with my research is that nationalism, African nationalism it can be non-political. And so when we see this, right, it's not, it's unorthodox, right? It's southpaw. And so it's unorthodox. But we see this ideology only when we consider women's stories and women's history. And I think this is one of the importance of doing gender studies and women's history and things like of that nature, because it opens up something more to us than what we previously would have known. Because the record that we have now for African nationalism, African intellectual history is very male-centered. But when we bring in these women's stories, now we have this whole new ideology of nationalism that is portrayed, it portrays self-determination in a way that is not usually, right, the narrative of self-determination. So we don't usually see nationalism as non-political, but they have their reasons for that. And I just finished my book manuscript on that, so it's out with readers now. So we can talk more about that later. But yeah, so that was my trajectory into, the FLAS. And the last question that Emily had sent out before that I'll speak on is that question about how AI affects, languages. Like, how do we see the importance of learning languages in this age of AI? And I will say this, AI has its benefits, and we can't take away from that. But we've also seen some challenges. And I think that educators broadly, in academia have seen some challenges. I think that we are in an economy of convenience, and AI can definitely make things convenient, for us. But like I said, it does have its challenges as well. And I think that educators broadly in academia have noted that there have been some issues with students' zealousness, with their zeal for inquiry, and also with communication. And I think that learning languages helps us to, not only have zeal for inquiry and, critical thinking and things like that and human connection, but it helps us with situational awareness and, all kinds of other things. So I think that with learning Yoruba, I was able to work on many more skills, especially that zeal for inquiry that helped me to go into developing my own theory, right? And also communication. So when you can, I remember when I was in the Congo in 2023 and I couldn't speak French. And so I used Google Translate, right? And so I was only able to connect with the person that I was trying to communicate with to a certain level, because I just couldn't, we couldn't have that connection. I couldn't understand them to a certain level. Like, we could communicate a little, but I couldn't really understand them to a certain extent. But with Yoruba, since I knew it so well, I connected with people on so many different, levels there. Because I was able to understand more intimately what they were thinking, what they wanted me to know, and also context cues and cultural awareness. All of that is wrapped up in learning languages. So I think that in this age, well, I remember I went to a conference and this woman who was writing, I think she wrote Algorithms of Blackness and about how implicit bias is also a part of AI generation and algorithms and things like that, because people who are creating the AI programs, they have not dealt with their own implicit bias. So that implicit bias is in those programs. She said, I will never forget that, she said that when students come out of programs, the businesses that hire them have to now spend money on finishing school for them because they cannot connect with people. They don't know how to hold eye contact. They don't know how to communicate. So there are things that I think that learning languages will help in terms of, even in this age of AI. Especially with that human connection, with deeper inquiry, with context cues, situational awareness, all of these different things. I think that Yoruba is a very, very poetic and intellectual language. I never will forget being in the archives and reading a document. Instead of saying that these were prisoners, it said those whose shadows have darkened the prison yard, And so it's just a, beautiful, beautiful language. And I think we can get so much out of language study. And the last thing that I'll share is that on that first Fulbright GPA that I did in Nigeria, there was someone there who did not study Yoruba and who only wanted the Fulbright name. And she was very rude and mean to the teacher. She cursed them out. She left, she told them Yoruba was useless, and she left and became a professor of African history at a prestigious at an Ivy League. And so I looked at that and I said, you know what, I don't want to be that way. I want to give back. I want to be respectful. I think that learning the language helps you to respect these other cultures. And someone gave me the key, literally gave me the key to the door of the archive because I could speak Yoruba to them. So that was very pivotal for my research. And so I said to myself that I want to look at every interaction that I have with different eyes, right? With an intrinsic value model, not a deficit model. And I think that learning the language helped me to look at every interaction with people there in Nigeria with intrinsic value. So thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you. I'll open it up for questions. I just wanted to make a little comment. Maybe you could share the prayer that because I'm thinking, I just wanted to share this anecdote that I'm applying for a grant to be able to do research on African migrants in Mexico, and specifically Mexico City, because there's been a huge spike in the numbers of those people. And I learned about that because I was sought out by this sort of center in Mexico City that urgently needed Wolof Spanish translation and to help some kids that were one kid from Mauritania, one from Gambia, one from Senegal, that were sort of caught in this, that were traveling alone, and in Mexico they're not allowed to do so as migrants, and so they sort of keep them in these detention centers basically. And so they needed, and because of my language skills, I was able to help them find a path, speak to their families, translate, and find a path for them to get to the United States, which was their goal. And now that those possibilities of coming into, seeking, asylum in the United States is pretty much non-existent, a lot of those migrants are going to stay in Mexico is my theory. And so I see, my language skills as super crucial to even just applying for that grant, right? Having a certain kind of legitimacy to say, I'm the person that can, which is, selling yourself in a grant, right? Just like, I'm the only person that can do this. And so I was really, that was sort of one of the most satisfying ways in which I've been able to use the language. So I'd love to hear what that prayer is. any questions? Well, we'll open it up to if anyone has questions. We have about 10 minutes, I think.
One of the wonderful stories, by the way, and so I think Lisa probably feels inside, you know, it's wonderful to hear these of all those hours we put into fighting for more FLAS fellowships at MSU and getting the proposal in on time. And I just thought I'd mention a funny little story. In that one case, we had problems, that we're having problems transferring data from the Excel table that we had put a lot of our data on enrollments and languages and so on into the, at that time, WordPerfect program to get our Title VI proposal. We had everything done except that we got later and later and later. And finally, it was after midnight of the day of which their closest deadline. So I said, we'll make a try. So we had the proposal, we prepared the envelopes, we got it in, we had the postage on it. So, and I drove down to, was the main post office down on Collins Road on down South Harrison, any rate. And I said, you know, I asked if we could go in, and they finally let me in the back room where the workers were. And I said, you know, I don't know if you're from Michigan State, but we've got a whole group of graduate students at Michigan State whose future depends on this proposal getting to Washington. And I know that it's after midnight, was the deadline for it. So
Tell us what you did.
I said, everybody owns the date back just a few hours back. I said, and I find it, one of the people said, yeah, we ought to do that for I support Michigan State. So they set it back, and we actually got the proposal in, and we got the fellowships.
Statute of limitations.
See, there's a lot of support for green out there. Anyway, but the question I wanted to ask was, one of the follow-up programs we did to have successful, you all are doing, and your work was, we got some extra Title VI money for undergraduate education, and we were offering summer African language program, which I know some of you may have taken advantage of. But our proposal was to get money to bring community college and HBCU faculty to come and do the African language. And we promised, if you do the full summer, stay the whole route, and then continue to work on your language back in your own institution. And this next year, we'll pay for your summer trip to go in the area where you're doing your language, to follow up with the language. And all sorts of partnerships were built, which is what was our real goal, between their institutions and other African institutions that were outside of us. So I was just curious to the extent to which your FLAS fellowships and the language and your research there among the people has led to institutional partnerships or individual partnerships. By the way, a little footnote here, hearing about our program, the Colegio de Mexico sent up some of their faculty and their director to take part in it as well. So it was an international outreach with African language as well. But have you developed partnerships that have stayed from your institution or personally with faculty and people there, or maybe NGOs and public institutions that you did research with?
I would share. I kind of mentioned it in my discussion within the two dialogues, right? And cultivating those particular relationships with NISA, the Nelson Mandela Museum, the Nelson Mandela University, Stellenbosch, right? I did all that as a graduate student. And the FLAS fellowship was the first fellowship that I received, major fellowship I received from, Michigan State University, that allowed me to have these particular partnerships first with faculty, who knew the language, like Dr. Sabana, right? And so these partnerships continue today. I believe still today, you all are doing Ubuntu things, right? I hear it, I see it, online. Also, the Nelson Mandela Museum, I still stay in contact with people at the Nelson Mandela Museum. I was also became the cultural heritage ambassador of the Nelson Mandela Museum, which I take very seriously, when it comes to spreading information and culture surrounding South Africa. And I still have these particular connections with, faculty from UNISA from when I studied South Africa. And so it continues, and it's amazing, how the FLAS is a seed, right, that continues to grow. Sometimes when you're a grad student, you don't necessarily realize like what these particular things and things will do. And I'm just, always in awe when I hear Dr. Martin's story, right? And, how she's been able to really leverage the knowledge and get these beautiful Fulbright and also teach students and maintain these wonderful relationships in Nigeria. But yeah, I still have those particular relationships, right? And I'm currently working on my book, Archiving Africana Women's Stories, African-Centered Education in South Africa and Detroit, in which I'm talking about that particular experience and how I interviewed these particular women and worked on this preservation theory, right, that I linked towards my experience when I was at the Nelson Mandela Museum, and as well as the Ubuntu Dialogues was not just centered in the beginning with Michigan State, but we were in Detroit, we went to Detroit, so we were centering relationships not only with Michigan State University, but we were having relationships and conversations with people at Wayne State University, with cultural heritage institutions in Detroit, particularly the Hush House Museum. And so I love the fact that, you went forward, with the FLAS Fellowship and opened it up to community colleges and historically Black universities. I was a Margaret Walker Fellow at Jackson State University. I'm a big fan of HBCUs, and I think if we all continue in our capacity as we are doing now to cultivate those particular relationships, bringing back language and our experiences in the country, for me, South Africa, the FLAS legacy will continue.
Yeah. Amen. Yes.
So I wanted to also say something, because it's a great question. And I think it's something that one of the things that you gain perspective on after you graduate from the PhD is how much of a unique place like a university with Title VI institutions is compared to sort of the world out there. And how unique it is to have these opportunities. And I remember in 2018, sort of after my FLAS publishing an article, my first article in the South African Theater Journal, and my advisor actually got quite mad at me because I didn't tell him beforehand. And it was sort of speaking out of turn, that sort of thing. But it was an article about the history of South African humor, and it got my name out there. And the next summer, I received this email out of the blue. This was right before I was going to do my Fulbright Hayes DDRA, from this person, Izu Wankwa, who was writing to me from Stellenbosch, from Stias. So he's from Nigeria, scholar from Nigeria, but he was doing a fellowship at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study. And he was inviting me on the basis of this article that I'd published to be part of this symposium on African stand-up comedy, which as far as he knew was the first one that had ever been. And I show up in October. It was while I was doing my dissertation research, and I found myself there with a seat at the table, as even though it was in South Africa, there were only two people who were working on South Africa at the conference. And mine was the only project that was based on actual interviews with comedians rather than sort of analyzing published, comedy specials and stuff. And so I'm still in contact in a WhatsApp group with the sort of African stand-up comedy study group. A lot of collaborations have come from that. And, I think that obviously none of that stuff, and I think it probably goes for everybody here, like none of that stuff without that basic sort of language knowledge that piques people's interest, hooks people in, you're able to find your people. And these are people I had no idea existed, that were in Egypt, that were in Malawi, that were in Uganda, working on South African stand-up or African stand-up comedy in different languages and stuff. And I'm, super grateful for that.
Yeah, and I'll also say that for me, it definitely helped me to grow my network. So I have a very strong network there in Nigeria. And institutionally, actually, so the gender studies program at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, is within their African studies unit. And I'm working to try to figure out how we can connect them with the University of California right now. So that will be an institutional relationship that's come, because of, the ability to do this language study. And then also, the foundation that I co-founded there in Nigeria, we're definitely, branching out, still building. And as a matter of fact, one of the ways that God provided for me when I was in my program was that the University of Western Michigan, they just contacted me. I didn't have to apply, but they contacted me one day and like, hey, could you teach this class for us? And I was like, what? Yeah, I can teach this class. And it was a class for public administration. I'm like, I don't know. We're gonna do this. We're gonna make this work, because I gotta pay my rent. And it was actually it was grant writing for nonprofits. And now I have a nonprofit that I've co-founded in Nigeria. So all of these things really came full circle. And so I trained a team there in Nigeria to write grants for the nonprofit so that now they're going to be sending out money. That's a part of our funding model. I do workshops for them, on applying abroad for students there who want to apply abroad. That brings in some income, for them. I do cohorts where we train people, more specifically on how to write statements to universities and things like that, and reach out to professors abroad, when they want to apply. So, that's definitely a strong relationship, and we're always looking to branch that, relationship out and connect them with different, universities and things like that over here too. And that's the JEED Foundation, is JEED. And they're on Instagram, and they have a website. You can go and check it out, and help support them in any way you can. Share the information, donate whatever way you can. But yeah, it definitely has helped to build relationships, and I really want to get that relationship started up between University of Ibadan and the University of California.
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time. We already